America's most dangerous killers. The prison built for the men America feared most. The drive to ADX Florence does not feel dramatic at first. You pass empty roads, dry land, small buildings, mountains sitting quietly in the distance. The town itself looks calm, almost forgettable. If someone drove through Florence, Colorado without knowing what stood nearby, they might never guess that one of the most feared prisons in the world was hidden there. And maybe that is part of what makes the place feel unsettling. Because ADX Florence was never built to be famous. It was built to disappear, to exist far away from cities, far away from noise, far away from ordinary life. A place designed not just to imprison dangerous men, but to completely separate them from the rest of society. The prison opened in 1994. Officially, it is called the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. But almost nobody calls it that. To most people, it is simply ADX, or supermax. And over the years, the prison gained another nickname, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But many people who know the prison well say that comparison does not even come close. Because unlike Alcatraz, which still allowed prisoners to eat together, work together, and speak to one another, ADX Florence was built around something much harsher: isolation, silence, total control. This was not a prison designed to rehabilitate people in the traditional sense. It was built for inmates the federal government believed could not be managed anywhere else. Men accused of running gangs from inside prison walls. Terrorists connected to attacks that killed innocent people. Prisoners with histories of violence against guards and inmates alike. The government believed some people were simply too dangerous for ordinary prisons. And ADX Florence became the answer to that fear. But to understand why this prison exists, you have to go back years before the first inmate ever arrived in Colorado. Because ADX Florence was born out of panic and bloodshed. In the early 1980s, federal prisons across the United States were dealing with a growing problem. Violence inside prisons was getting worse. Gang activity was spreading. Some inmates had become so powerful that prison officials feared they were controlling criminal operations even while locked up. Then came one of the most shocking moments in federal prison history. At the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, 2 correctional officers were murdered by inmates in separate incidents on the same day. The killings sent shockwaves through the prison system. Correctional officers already worked in dangerous conditions, but this felt different. Prison officials believed they were losing control. There was growing fear that some inmates no longer feared punishment at all. After the murders, Marion Prison entered permanent lockdown. Inmates were isolated for long periods, movement became heavily restricted, and officials started rethinking the future of maximum security incarceration in America. That moment changed everything. Because behind closed doors, officials inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons began discussing a new kind of prison entirely. A facility built specifically for inmates considered uncontrollable. A prison where communication could be restricted down to the smallest detail. A place where violence could be minimized through architecture itself. Concrete, steel, remote-controlled doors, single-person cells, surveillance everywhere. The idea was simple, at least on paper. If dangerous inmates could not interact with others, they would have fewer opportunities to organize attacks, influence gangs, or harm prison staff. But creating a prison like that meant confronting another question too. What happens to the human mind when isolation becomes permanent? At the time, many officials believed the answer did not matter as much as safety. And so construction moved forward. By the time ADX Florence opened in 1994, the prison looked less like a traditional penitentiary and more like something designed by engineers focused entirely on control. Every detail inside the facility served a purpose. Even the windows were carefully designed. Prisoners could see the sky and little else. Officials wanted to prevent inmates from learning the layout of the prison or communicating through visual signals. Most cells were built from poured concrete. The bed was concrete. The desk was concrete. In many cases, even the shower systems were tightly controlled from outside the cell. The message was clear from the beginning. Nothing inside this prison was accidental. Everything was designed to reduce risk. Everything was designed to remove control from the inmate. And for the people working there, that level of control was considered necessary. Over the years, former correctional officers who worked at ADX Florence described the prison as extremely structured, quiet, and tense. Unlike traditional prisons where noise constantly fills the hallways, ADX often operated in near silence. Guards communicated carefully. Movement was tightly organized. Inmates rarely saw one another directly. Some former staff members said the quiet itself could become unnerving, because silence inside a prison does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means pressure. The inmates sent to ADX Florence were not random prisoners pulled from ordinary prison populations. Many had histories that terrified officials. Some had attacked correctional officers before. Others had connections to organized crime or terrorism. Some were accused of ordering violence from behind bars. The prison was designed specifically to contain influence. And over time, some of the most infamous criminals in America would end up there. Theodore Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber. Ramzi Youssef, connected to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber. Gang leaders, cartel figures, men whose names became linked with fear in headlines across the country. But despite the prison's reputation, the reality inside ADX Florence was more complicated than many people realized, because the prison quickly became the center of another debate. One that still continues today. What is the purpose of prison? Is it punishment, protection, rehabilitation, or simply containment? Supporters of ADX Florence argued the prison saved lives. They believed dangerous inmates who attacked guards or organized violence needed to be isolated. Many correctional officers viewed the prison as necessary protection against inmates capable of extreme harm. And for families of prison staff, that argument mattered deeply. When people talk about dangerous prisons, conversations often focus on inmates. But correctional officers walk into those buildings every day knowing violence can happen without warning. Many officers spend years working inside environments filled with tension, manipulation, and fear. For them, ADX Florence represented security. A prison where dangerous inmates could be controlled before another officer lost their life. But critics saw something else. Human rights organizations, psychologists, and former inmates began raising serious concerns about long-term isolation. Some experts argued that keeping people alone inside concrete cells for years at a time could cause severe psychological damage. Depression, anxiety, hallucinations, paranoia. Some former inmates described the isolation as mentally crushing. Others said they lost track of time completely. There were reports of prisoners talking to themselves for hours. Some experienced emotional breakdowns. Some harmed themselves. Critics argued that isolation on that level was not simply punishment anymore. They believed it fundamentally changed the human mind. And that debate became larger than ADX Florence itself. Because the prison forced America to confront an uncomfortable question. What do societies do with people they fear most? The existence of ADX Florence reflects something deeper than prison policy. It reflects fear. Fear of violence. Fear of terrorism. Fear of losing control inside prison walls. Fear that some individuals cannot safely exist in normal society anymore. And after events like terrorist attacks, prison murders, and gang violence, many Americans supported harsher security measures. They believed some inmates had earned isolation through their actions. Others believed no human being should live under those conditions for decades. The argument still divides people today. And maybe that division is part of what keeps public fascination with ADX Florence alive. Because the prison feels mysterious even now. Most Americans will never see the inside of it. Very little footage exists from daily life inside the facility. Much of what people know comes from court records, rare interviews, lawsuits, government reports, and testimony from former inmates or staff. That lack of visibility created its own mythology around the prison. People imagine dark hallways, endless silence, inmates disappearing into concrete boxes for years. And while some of those images are exaggerated by popular culture, the reality is still deeply unsettling. A prisoner inside ADX Florence may spend up to 23 hours a day alone in a cell. Recreation often happens in isolated concrete enclosures. Meals are passed through slots in steel doors. Communication is heavily monitored and restricted. For some inmates, years pass with almost no meaningful human contact. And that reality changes people. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes slowly, quietly. A former inmate once described the experience as existing without truly living. Another said the hardest part was not the walls or the guards, but the feeling that time itself had stopped moving. Even critics who strongly oppose violent criminals sometimes struggle with the conditions inside supermax prisons. Because once isolation becomes severe enough, the punishment moves beyond physical confinement and into psychology. And psychology is harder to measure, harder to control, harder to reverse. But despite decades of criticism, ADX Florence remains open because there are still inmates considered too dangerous for other facilities. There are still fears about prison violence, gang leadership, and terrorism. And federal officials continue to argue that without a prison like ADX, some individuals could create serious threats inside ordinary prison systems. So the prison continues operating in the Colorado desert, largely hidden from public view. The doors still open electronically. The cameras still watch every movement. The silence still hangs over the hallways. And somewhere inside those concrete walls are men the government decided could never safely return to normal prison populations again. But the prison itself is only one part of the story, because eventually the names inside ADX Florence would become just as infamous as the prison holding them. Men whose crimes horrified the country. Men who became symbols of fear long before they ever entered a prison cell. And in many ways, their stories explain why ADX Florence became one of the most controversial prisons in America. The men the government feared most. By the time ADX Florence had been operating for a few years, the prison had already become something larger than a correctional facility. It had become a symbol, a place the federal government used for inmates it believed could not safely exist anywhere else. And the names arriving there only added to the prison's reputation. Some of the men sent to ADX Florence were already infamous long before they entered the building. Their crimes had appeared on television screens, newspaper headlines, and FBI wanted lists across the country. For many Americans, these were not just prisoners. They were the faces of fear during some of the darkest moments in modern criminal history. One of the most well-known inmates ever housed at ADX Florence was Theodore Kaczynski, better known to the public as the Unabomber. For nearly 20 years, Kaczynski carried out a bombing campaign across the United States. His targets included university professors, airline officials, and people connected to modern technology. The bombs were homemade, carefully constructed, and often hidden inside ordinary-looking packages. The attacks killed 3 people and injured many others. What frightened investigators was not just the violence itself, but the patience behind it. The bombings stretched across nearly 2 decades. Every new package created panic. People became afraid to open mail. Universities increased security. Federal investigators spent years trying to identify the person responsible. At one point, the FBI called it one of the longest and most expensive investigations in agency history. And during all those years, Theodore Kaczynski lived in near isolation inside a small cabin in Montana. No electricity, no running water, no modern comforts. To many people, that detail became deeply unsettling later, because the man responsible for such carefully planned attacks had spent years living quietly and almost invisibly. When investigators finally arrested him in 1996, they discovered bomb materials, journals, and detailed writings inside the cabin. Kaczynski later pleaded guilty and received multiple life sentences without parole. Eventually, he was transferred to ADX Florence. And in some ways, the move felt strangely fitting to outsiders. A man who had chosen isolation for much of his adult life was now being placed into one of the most isolated prison systems in America. But Kaczynski was only one of many infamous inmates who would enter those concrete walls. Another was Ramzi Youssef, one of the men connected to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City. The attack happened years before the events of September 11th, but even then, the bombing shook the country. Explosives detonated inside a parking garage beneath the North Tower, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000 others. Investigators later concluded the attack was intended to cause catastrophic destruction, potentially bringing down one tower onto the other. The scale of that possibility terrified people. Youssef fled the United States after the bombing and became the target of an international manhunt. Eventually, he was captured in Pakistan in 1995 and brought back to the United States to stand trial. Because of the severity of his crimes and concerns about security, he too would later be housed at ADX Florence. For prison officials, inmates like Youssef represented a unique challenge. The concern was not simply violence inside prison walls. Officials also worried about influence, communication, symbolism. Some inmates carried reputations powerful enough to inspire others even while incarcerated. And that fear became even stronger after the September 11th attacks in 2001. America changed after September 11th. Security concerns expanded dramatically. Federal agencies became intensely focused on preventing future terrorist attacks. And prisons housing individuals connected to terrorism faced increased scrutiny. That atmosphere is part of what brought another inmate to ADX Florence, Richard Reed. Most people knew him as the shoe bomber. In December 2001, Reed boarded a flight from Paris to Miami, carrying explosives hidden inside his shoes. During the flight, he attempted to ignite the device. Passengers and crew members noticed his behavior and intervened before the bomb could fully detonate. The plane landed safely, but the incident shocked the public, because it reminded Americans how vulnerable ordinary life could feel after September 11th. Airports changed dramatically after the attack attempt. Security screenings became stricter. Removing shoes during airport security checks eventually became routine because of Richard Reed. And after his conviction, Reed was sent to ADX Florence. The prison increasingly became associated with inmates tied to terrorism, organized violence, and national fear. But not every prisoner there became famous because of attacks against civilians. Some were known for violence inside the prison system itself. Gang leaders also became a major part of ADX Florence's population. For decades, prison gangs had created serious problems throughout American correctional systems. Some organizations extended their influence far beyond prison walls, controlling drug trafficking, violence, extortion, and criminal operations both inside and outside incarceration facilities. Officials worried that certain gang leaders could continue directing criminal activity even while serving life sentences. That concern changed how prisons approached communication. Letters were monitored. Phone calls were restricted. Movement became tightly controlled. ADX Florence was specifically designed to disrupt influence. Isolation was not just about punishment. It was also about separation. Officials believed gang power depended heavily on communication and organization. If inmates could be isolated from one another, prison authorities believed they could weaken those networks. But the psychological effects of that strategy remained controversial. Because while prison officials focused on security, critics focused on humanity. And over time, stories began emerging from inside ADX Florence that complicated the public image of the prison. Some inmates described overwhelming loneliness. Others spoke about mental deterioration during years of isolation. Lawsuits filed against the federal government argued that conditions inside the prison caused severe psychological harm, especially for inmates already struggling with mental illness. Former prisoners described talking to themselves for hours. Some reported hearing voices. Others developed obsessive routines just to maintain a sense of structure. For outsiders, those stories raised difficult questions. How much isolation is necessary? At what point does security become cruelty? And does locking dangerous individuals away in near-total solitude actually make society safer long-term? The answers depended heavily on who you asked. Families of correctional officers often viewed the prison very differently from prison reform advocates. For officers working in dangerous environments, ADX Florence represented protection. Some inmates housed there had histories of assaulting staff members, organizing violence, or threatening prison operations. To many guards, strict control measures were not abstract policy decisions. They were survival tools. and correctional officers themselves rarely receive much public attention in conversations about prisons. Yet they spend years working in tense environments where violence can happen quickly. Some officers develop chronic stress. Others describe constant hypervigilance, always aware that a simple mistake could become dangerous. That perspective shaped how many prison employees viewed ADX Florence. Critics, however, argued that long-term isolation created another kind of danger entirely. They believed extreme solitary confinement damaged people psychologically, sometimes permanently. One former federal inmate described the experience as feeling erased from normal human existence. Another explained that after years without meaningful interaction, ordinary conversations began to feel unfamiliar. And that may be part of what makes ADX Florence so unsettling to the public imagination. The prison forces people to confront two fears at the same time: fear of violent criminals, and fear of what isolation can do to human beings. Because in many ways, the prison exists at the intersection of those two anxieties. Some Americans see ADX Florence as necessary protection against people capable of extraordinary violence. Others see it as evidence of a prison system willing to push psychological punishment to dangerous extremes. Neither side completely ignores the other. Most people understand why dangerous inmates create fear. Most people also understand that permanent isolation can deeply affect the human mind. And somewhere between those realities sits ADX Florence, continuing to operate in silence while debates about justice, punishment, and security continue outside its walls. Inside the prison, life moves according to routines built entirely around control. Inmates wake alone, eat alone, exercise alone. Time passes slowly inside concrete cells designed to minimize interaction. For some prisoners, years disappear inside that structure. And over time, even the public fascination surrounding ADX Florence started changing. At first, many people viewed the prison almost like a fortress from an action movie. A place holding legendary criminals in total lockdown. But as more details emerged about life inside the facility, the conversation became more uncomfortable. Because eventually the focus shifted away from the walls and toward the psychological cost of living behind them. And that cost, according to critics and former inmates, could be devastating. Life inside the most isolated prison in America. There is something deeply unsettling about extreme silence. Most people never truly experience it. Even late at night, there is usually some kind of background noise. Cars passing outside. A television in another room. Air moving through vents. The distant sound of people living ordinary lives. Inside ADX Florence, silence becomes something different. Former inmates and prison experts have described the atmosphere inside the prison as controlled, quiet, and emotionally heavy. The structure of daily life revolves around separation. Separation from crowds. Separation from physical contact. Separation from unpredictability. For prisoners housed in the most restrictive units, almost every hour of the day is spent alone. A typical cell inside ADX Florence is small and heavily controlled. Much of the furniture is made from poured concrete. The bed extends directly from the wall. There is a steel toilet, a sink, a desk, and very little else. Even the windows are designed with intention. Prisoners can usually see the sky, but not much of the surrounding world. Officials wanted to prevent inmates from understanding the layout of the prison or communicating visually with others. To supporters of the prison, those measures represent security. To critics, they represent something colder, because the experience of isolation goes beyond physical confinement. Over time, it changes how people think, feel, and relate to the world around them. Former inmates have described losing track of time. Some developed repetitive routines simply to maintain a sense of order. Others spoke about conversations becoming difficult after years with minimal social interaction. One former prisoner explained that eventually the mind starts searching for stimulation anywhere it can find it. Tiny sounds become important. Small changes in routine feel enormous. Thoughts begin repeating endlessly because there is little else to interrupt them. And that psychological pressure is part of what makes ADX Florence so controversial. The prison was built around the idea that control prevents violence. But critics argue that extreme isolation can create different forms of damage instead. Mental health experts have warned for years about the possible effects of long-term solitary confinement. Depression, anxiety, panic attacks, emotional numbness, difficulty concentrating, hallucinations. Some inmates at ADX Florence reportedly spent years with extremely limited human contact. For many people outside prison systems, that reality is difficult to fully imagine. Most human beings are social by nature. Even brief conversations, eye contact, or physical presence play a major role in emotional stability. Inside ADX Florence, much of that disappears. Meals are delivered through slots in steel doors. Movement through hallways is tightly controlled. Recreation often happens alone inside enclosed concrete or fenced areas. Even showers are managed carefully to reduce interaction and risk. Supporters argue those procedures exist for important reasons. Some inmates housed there have histories involving severe violence, terrorism, or attacks against prison staff. Officials maintain that high-security restrictions protect both guards and other inmates. But the debate becomes more complicated when discussions shift toward mental health. Because even some people who support maximum security prisons struggle with the idea of prolonged isolation. And over the years, lawsuits against the Federal Bureau of Prisons brought increasing attention to conditions inside ADX Florence. Attorneys representing inmates argued that prisoners with serious mental illness were being kept in environments that worsened psychological problems rather than treating them. Those lawsuits helped expose details about life inside the prison that many Americans had never considered before. Not dramatic movie scenes, not violent escapes, but ordinary days filled with silence, repetition, and isolation. And for some inmates, that routine lasted not for weeks or months, but for years. Violence behind the walls. People often imagine violence inside prison as something loud and immediate. A fight in a hallway, a riot breaking out, guards rushing through metal doors while alarms echo through the building. And while those things have happened throughout the history of American prisons, violence inside places like ADX Florence is usually different. Quieter, more controlled, but never fully gone. That is one of the contradictions surrounding ADX Florence. The prison was specifically designed to stop violence before it could spread. In many ways, it succeeded. The extreme isolation limits opportunities for coordinated attacks, gang meetings, and large-scale riots. But isolation does not erase violence completely. Sometimes it changes its shape. Former correctional officers who worked in high-security federal prisons have described the psychological tension of the job as constant. Even during quiet moments, officers remained alert. Every interaction mattered. Every movement inside the prison followed procedure because mistakes could become dangerous very quickly. And many of the inmates housed at ADX Florence did not arrive there because they broke ordinary prison rules. Some were transferred after committing serious acts of violence while already incarcerated. That detail is important. By the time many inmates reached ADX, prison officials already believed traditional correctional systems had failed to control them. Some had assaulted guards. Some had attacked fellow inmates. Others were accused of organizing violence from behind bars through gang connections or outside communication. The prison itself became a response to fear inside the federal prison system. Fear that some inmates no longer feared consequences. And for correctional officers, that fear was not theoretical. Working inside maximum security prisons has always carried risks that most people outside the system rarely think about. Officers spend years interacting with individuals convicted of murder, terrorism, organized crime, and violent assault. Many guards describe learning to constantly read behavior, body language, and emotional changes because tension can escalate unexpectedly. A normal conversation can suddenly become hostile. A routine movement can become a threat. And unlike police officers who can leave dangerous scenes behind after a shift, correctional officers return to the same environment every single day. The same inmates, the same hallways, the same tension. That reality shaped how many prison staff viewed ADX Florence. To them, strict control procedures were not cruelty. They were protection. Some former officers defended the prison publicly, arguing that many critics underestimated how dangerous certain inmates could be. They believed the public often focused on inmate suffering while ignoring the emotional and physical risks faced by prison staff. And in some cases, those risks were severe. Throughout the broader history of American prisons, correctional officers have been assaulted, stabbed, beaten, and killed while performing their jobs. The murders at Marion Prison years earlier still haunted parts of the federal prison system. Those killings became one of the major reasons ADX Florence was created in the first place. The memory of those events never fully disappeared. Because prisons are environments built around control, but complete control is impossible. There is always tension beneath the surface. And that tension changes people on both sides of the bars. Former officers have spoken about chronic stress, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, and hypervigilance after years inside maximum security facilities. Some described becoming emotionally numb over time. Others struggled to leave prison tension behind when they returned home. One former correctional officer explained in an interview that working inside high-security prisons changes the way you see people. Not because every inmate is constantly violent, but because you are always aware of what could happen if control slips for even a moment. That constant awareness becomes mentally exhausting. And inside ADX Florence, where many inmates were considered among the most dangerous in the country, the pressure could feel even heavier. But violence inside prisons is not always physical. Sometimes it becomes psychological. That is something critics of ADX Florence repeatedly pointed to over the years. While the prison dramatically reduced opportunities for large-scale inmate violence, opponents argued that extreme isolation created another kind of harm instead. Quieter kind. One that happened inside the mind. Some former inmates described becoming emotionally unstable after long periods without meaningful interaction. Others reported paranoia, panic attacks, depression, or overwhelming hopelessness. There were allegations of self-harm among prisoners struggling psychologically inside isolation units. And as those stories became public, the national conversation around ADX Florence slowly began changing. At first, many Americans viewed the prison almost entirely through the lens of fear. Dangerous inmates, terrorists, gang leaders, violent criminals locked away behind concrete walls. But over time, attention shifted toward conditions inside the prison itself. Could isolation become harmful enough to create its own form of violence? That question became central to lawsuits filed against the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In 2012, attorneys representing several inmates filed a lawsuit arguing that prisoners with serious mental illness were being held under conditions that worsened their psychological state. The lawsuit described inmates allegedly experiencing hallucinations, self-harm, and severe emotional deterioration. The government denied many of the accusations and defended the prison's operations. But the case drew national attention, because suddenly the public conversation was no longer only about dangerous criminals. It was also about what prolonged isolation might do to a human being over time. And the answers were deeply uncomfortable. Psychologists who studied solitary confinement warned that human beings are not designed for extended social isolation. Even people without prior mental illness can begin experiencing psychological distress after long periods alone. Sleep problems, memory issues, depression, difficulty concentrating, emotional instability. The effects vary from person to person, but critics argued the structure of supermax incarceration itself carried serious risks. Supporters of ADX Florence responded with a different argument. They pointed out that many inmates housed there had histories of extreme violence. Some had harmed prison staff. Others were considered ongoing security threats connected to terrorism or organized criminal groups. Officials maintained that restrictive conditions were necessary to maintain order and safety. And for many Americans, that argument remained persuasive, especially after periods of national fear. Terrorist attacks, gang violence, mass casualty crimes. Moments like those often reshape public attitudes toward punishment and security. People become more willing to accept harsh measures when they believe danger is growing. ADX Florence emerged from exactly that kind of fear. Not fear of ordinary crime, but fear of individuals considered uncontrollable. And over the years, the prison became a reflection of how America responds to extreme threats. Isolation was not viewed simply as punishment anymore. It became a strategy of containment, a way to separate dangerous individuals from both society and other inmates. But even with all its security measures, the prison never fully escaped controversy. Because behind every debate about prison policy sits another uncomfortable reality. Most inmates inside ADX Florence will eventually grow old there. Some will die there. Years pass differently inside extreme isolation. Holidays disappear. Relationships fade. The outside world moves forward while daily life inside the prison changes very little. Former inmates have described becoming detached from time itself. And that reality creates a strange emotional contradiction for the public. Many people believe dangerous criminals deserve severe punishment. At the same time, prolonged isolation often feels disturbing even to those who support tough prison systems. That tension has never fully disappeared, and perhaps it never will, because ADX Florence exists in the middle of one of the hardest questions any justice system faces. How do you contain people considered extraordinarily dangerous without losing part of your own humanity in the process? The prison does not answer that question cleanly. It simply exists, silent, controlled, hidden in the Colorado desert while arguments about justice continue far beyond its walls. And despite all the fear surrounding the inmates held there, another part of the prison's reputation continued growing over the years. Its almost mythical reputation for security. Because if ADX Florence became known for anything besides isolation, it was this: nobody escapes. The human mind under extreme isolation. There is a reason people keep returning to the debate around ADX Florence. It is not just because of the inmates, and it is not just because of the crimes. It is because the prison forces people to confront a deeply uncomfortable question about punishment itself. Not whether dangerous people should go to prison. Most people agree that some crimes deserve severe consequences. The harder question is what those consequences should actually look like once somebody is locked away. Because ADX Florence does not simply remove freedom. According to critics, it removes something else too: normal human connection. And over time, that became the center of one of the biggest controversies surrounding the prison. By the early 2000s, psychologists, legal advocates, and human rights organizations were increasingly focused on the effects of long-term solitary confinement. Some experts argued that isolation severe enough and long enough could fundamentally damage the human mind. The concern was not limited to ADX Florence alone. Solitary confinement existed in many prison systems across the United States. But because ADX became the most famous supermax prison in the country, it also became the symbol of that larger debate. Critics argued the prison represented the extreme edge of isolation-based incarceration. And the stories emerging from inside the facility disturbed many people. Former inmates described overwhelming loneliness. Some said they struggled to concentrate after years without regular conversation. Others reported depression so severe that even simple daily routines became emotionally exhausting. One former prisoner explained that after enough time alone, the mind begins turning inward constantly. Thoughts repeat endlessly because there is little outside stimulation to interrupt them. Small frustrations become overwhelming. Tiny routines become emotionally important. Days begin blending together until time itself starts feeling unreal. Another inmate described the experience of hearing almost nothing for long stretches except footsteps, metal doors, and distant echoes moving through the prison. At first, some people hearing those accounts dismissed them. After all, many inmates housed at ADX Florence had committed serious crimes. Public sympathy was limited. But over time, mental health experts began warning that the issue extended beyond sympathy for prisoners. Their argument was about psychology. Human beings, they said, are social creatures by nature. Conversation, eye contact, routine interaction, even the physical presence of others all play important roles in emotional stability. Remove those things long enough and the effects can become severe. Anxiety, panic attacks, memory problems, paranoia, hallucinations, emotional breakdowns. The effects vary from person to person, but psychologists argued prolonged isolation could push vulnerable individuals towards serious mental deterioration. And eventually those concerns reached the courts. In 2012, a lawsuit filed against the Federal Bureau of Prisons accused officials at ADX Florence of keeping mentally ill prisoners in conditions that worsened their psychological state. Attorneys representing inmates claimed some prisoners experienced severe psychiatric crises while housed inside the facility. The allegations were disturbing. According to court documents, some inmates harmed themselves repeatedly. Others allegedly suffered hallucinations or delusional episodes. There were claims of prisoners smearing feces on walls, screaming for hours, or falling into severe psychological distress after years of isolation. The federal government defended the prison and disputed many of the accusations. Officials maintained that the facility provided mental health services and argued that strict security measures remained necessary for particularly dangerous inmates. But regardless of where people stood on the lawsuit, the public conversation around ADX Florence changed. Because suddenly Americans were not only discussing violent criminals anymore. They were discussing the human mind, and whether isolation itself could become destructive enough to cross a moral line. The debate reached beyond politics. Some conservatives who strongly supported harsh punishment still questioned prolonged solitary confinement. Some liberals who criticized the prison still acknowledged the danger posed by certain inmates. The issue did not divide neatly. That is part of what makes ADX Florence so complicated. Almost everyone agrees some prisoners are dangerous. Almost everyone also understands, at least instinctively, that years of isolation could deeply affect a person psychologically. And somewhere between those realities sits the prison itself. Still operating. Still controversial. Still hidden behind concrete and steel in the Colorado desert. Families of inmates also became increasingly vocal over the years. Some described watching loved ones psychologically decline during incarceration. Others said communication became emotionally difficult because years in isolation changed how prisoners interacted with people. For families, the prison often created a strange emotional conflict. Some relatives acknowledged the crimes committed by inmates and understood why punishment existed. But they also believed no human being should spend decades under extreme isolation. That emotional tension appears repeatedly in discussions about ADX Florence. There are no simple heroes or villains in the debate. Only competing fears. Fear of violent criminals. Fear of psychological destruction. Fear of losing safety. Fear of losing humanity. Even some former correctional officers admitted the emotional atmosphere inside supermax prisons could become deeply unsettling over time. Guards working in highly isolated units sometimes described the environment as psychologically draining not only for inmates, but for staff as well. Because prisons built around silence affect everyone inside them. One former officer explained that after years working in restrictive housing units, the environment changes how people communicate. Interactions become procedural. Emotional distance grows. The constant focus on control slowly reshapes daily behavior. And that may be one of the least understood aspects of supermax prisons. Isolation does not only affect prisoners. It affects the atmosphere itself, the culture, the psychology of the entire environment. Everything becomes structured around containment. That structure is intentional. ADX Florence was never designed to feel human in the traditional sense. It was designed to reduce risk. Every security measure inside the prison exists because officials believed ordinary prison systems could not safely contain certain inmates. And supporters of the prison continue to defend that logic today. They point out that many prisoners sent to ADX Florence have histories involving terrorism, organized violence, attacks against guards, or gang leadership. Some are serving multiple life sentences for crimes that shocked the country. Supporters argue those realities matter. They believe critics sometimes discuss isolation without fully acknowledging the severity of the inmates involved. And for families of victims, conversations about inmate suffering can feel deeply frustrating. Because while debates continue about prison conditions, victims remain dead. Families remain grieving. Lives remain permanently destroyed. That perspective carries enormous emotional weight. One federal judge discussing sentencing in a separate violent criminal case once explained the problem clearly. The justice system often asks courts to balance two impossible realities at once: the humanity of the offender and the irreversible harm done to victims. And there is no formula that fully resolves that tension. ADX Florence exists inside that same moral conflict. For some Americans, the prison represents safety and accountability. For others, it represents a justice system willing to push human isolation beyond ethical limits. Neither side has fully won the argument, and maybe they never will, because prisons like ADX Florence force society to confront questions with no comfortable answers. What do you do with people considered too dangerous for ordinary incarceration? How far should punishment go? And at what point does protecting society begin changing society itself? Those questions became even more unsettling as years passed and inmates continued aging inside the prison. Because many prisoners housed there are not serving short sentences. Some will never leave. Some entered the prison as relatively young men and are now growing old behind concrete walls. Decades pass differently inside isolation. Technology changes outside. Cities change. Families age. Entire generations grow up while life inside the prison remains almost frozen. And that creates another strange reality about ADX Florence. For all the fear surrounding the inmates inside, the prison itself often feels emotionally frozen in time. The routines remain strict. The silence remains constant. The walls remain unchanged. Only the people inside slowly grow older. And perhaps that is what unsettles people most about the prison in the end. Not just the crimes, not just the security, but the idea of a place built almost entirely around permanent separation from normal human life. A place where punishment is measured not only in years, but in silence. And despite decades of lawsuits, criticism, and debate, ADX Florence continues operating much the same way it always has. Because for federal officials, one belief still outweighs every controversy surrounding the prison. Some inmates, they argue, are simply too dangerous to contain any other way. But the prison's reputation did not come only from isolation or infamous inmates. It also came from something else. The belief that once someone enters ADX Florence, escape is almost impossible. The prison nobody escapes. Every prison is built to keep people inside. But some prisons become famous because of the people who escape them. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary became legendary partly because of escape attempts. Movies, documentaries, and books turned prison escapes into stories of suspense and mystery. People became fascinated by the idea of outsmarting walls, guards, and locked doors. ADX Florence created a completely different reputation. Not because people escaped, but because almost nobody believes escape is even possible. The prison was designed with one goal above everything else: control. Every layer of the facility reflects that priority. Movement is restricted. Communication is restricted. Physical contact is restricted. Even visibility inside the prison is controlled carefully. Former officials have described ADX Florence as one of the most secure prisons ever built in the United States. And over the years, its reputation only grew larger. Part of that reputation comes from geography. The prison sits in a remote area of Colorado surrounded by open land and mountains. There are no crowded city streets nearby. No easy places to disappear. Even reaching the outer perimeter would already place someone in an environment designed for visibility and surveillance. But geography alone is not what makes ADX Florence intimidating. It is the layers. Everything inside the prison works in layers. Steel doors, electronic controls, surveillance cameras, motion detectors, armed patrols, controlled hallways, restricted inmate movement. Former correctional officers have explained that even simple inmate transportation inside the prison follows strict procedures. Prisoners are often escorted carefully through secured corridors while movement in surrounding areas is temporarily restricted. The goal is always the same: limit unpredictability, reduce opportunity, maintain control. And according to federal officials, those systems have been highly effective. No inmate has ever successfully escaped ADX Florence. That fact became part of the prison's mythology over time. the public began viewing the prison almost like a modern fortress hidden inside the Colorado desert. A place designed not simply to imprison dangerous people, but to remove any realistic possibility of freedom altogether. And for some Americans, that idea brought reassurance. Because many inmates housed there were associated with crimes that created enormous fear. Terrorism, organized violence, prison attacks, high-profile murders. Some people believed individuals connected to those crimes should never have even the smallest chance of escaping. But fascination with prison escapes runs deep in American culture, and ADX Florence became part of that fascination precisely because it appeared so impenetrable. People wanted to know what life inside a place like that actually looked like. Movies and television often exaggerated aspects of supermax prisons, portraying them almost like underground military compounds filled with constant violence and dramatic confrontations. The reality, according to former inmates and prison staff, was often much quieter. And in some ways, that quietness felt more disturbing. Because the prison's power did not come from chaos. Came from structure. Everything inside ADX Florence is meant to reduce uncertainty. Prisoners know when meals arrive. Guards follow strict procedures. Recreation schedules are controlled. Doors open electronically. Interactions remain limited and heavily monitored. The system is designed to remove spontaneity. Critics argue that same structure contributes to the psychological strain experienced by inmates. Supporters argue it is necessary for safety. And again, the prison sits directly in the middle of those competing views. One side sees containment. The other sees emotional erosion. But regardless of where people stand politically or morally, the prison's security reputation remains difficult to ignore. Over the years, even some inmates reportedly referred to ADX Florence as the end of the line. Not because sentences necessarily ended there, but because transfer out of the facility could be extremely difficult. For many prisoners, entering ADX meant entering a world defined almost entirely by restriction. That psychological reality matters. Because escape is not only physical. Human beings also escape mentally. Through conversation, through movement, through routine social interaction, through ordinary life experiences that remind people they still exist within the world around them. Inside ADX Florence, many of those experiences become limited or disappear altogether. And that creates a different kind of confinement beyond bars and walls. One former inmate described the experience as feeling suspended outside normal life. Another explained that after enough years in isolation, the outside world begins feeling distant and unreal, almost like something remembered from another lifetime. That emotional detachment is part of what continues making ADX Florence controversial decades after it opened. Because eventually the conversation around the prison stopped focusing only on whether inmates could escape physically. People began asking whether prolonged isolation could separate someone psychologically from ordinary human existence itself. And that question has no easy answer. Federal officials maintain that ADX Florence remains necessary because some inmates continue posing major security threats. Gang influence still exists inside prison systems. Terrorism concerns still exist. Violence against correctional officers still exists. Supporters of the prison argue those realities cannot be ignored simply because isolation feels emotionally uncomfortable. For them, the prison exists to prevent worse outcomes. And many Americans continue agreeing with that argument, especially when they think about the crimes committed by some inmates housed there. It is easier for the public to support harsh prison conditions when discussing abstract categories like terrorists or gang leaders. The emotional distance feels safer that way. But conversations become more complicated when attention shifts toward the daily psychological realities of confinement itself. That is where ADX Florence becomes unsettling even for some people who support tough sentencing. Because eventually most discussions return to the same uncomfortable point. What does years of near-total isolation actually do to a person? Not in theory, not politically, but psychologically. The prison forces society to sit with that question whether people want to or not. And perhaps that is why ADX Florence remains so fascinating to the public imagination. The prison represents more than security policy. It represents fear taken to its logical conclusion. Fear of violence. fear of losing control, fear of people considered impossible to rehabilitate. The result was a prison designed around total containment. A place where every wall, every hallway, every procedure exists to prevent danger before it begins. And in many ways, the system succeeded. The prison remains operational. Its security reputation remains intact. Its inmates remain behind bars. But the emotional and moral debate surrounding the prison never disappeared. Because while the walls of ADX Florence were designed to contain dangerous individuals, the larger questions surrounding the prison could never be locked down so easily. Questions about punishment, questions about humanity, questions about what societies become when fear shapes justice systems for long enough. And those questions lead to the final and perhaps most uncomfortable part of the story. What ADX Florence ultimately says about America itself. America's darkest prison. At some point, every conversation about ADX Florence stops being only about prison. It becomes a conversation about fear. Not ordinary fear either. Not the kind people feel walking alone at night or hearing about crime on the news. ADX Florence was built from a deeper kind of fear. The fear that some people cannot be controlled. The fear that certain acts of violence are so extreme, so calculated, so destructive, that ordinary systems are no longer enough to contain them. That fear shaped the prison from the beginning. It shaped the architecture, the routines, the isolation, the silence. Everything about ADX Florence reflects a country trying to answer one difficult question. What should society do with the people it fears most? And decades later, America still does not fully agree on the answer. Supporters of the prison argue that ADX Florence exists because reality forced it into existence. They point to prison murders, gang violence, terrorism, and attacks against correctional officers. They argue that some inmates proved, through years of violent behavior, that traditional prisons could not safely manage them. To those supporters, the prison is not cruel. It is necessary. A final level of containment for individuals considered ongoing threats to both prison staff and society itself. And when viewed through that lens, ADX Florence becomes easier to justify. Many Americans believe public safety must come first, even when the methods feel severe. Families of victims often feel strongly about that point. For them, conversations about inmate suffering can sound detached from the damage already done by violent crimes. Because victims do not get a second chance at life. Families do not get their loved ones back. That pain remains long after headlines disappear. And that perspective matters. But critics of the prison argue something equally powerful. They believe extreme isolation changes people in ways society still does not fully understand. Some psychologists compare prolonged solitary confinement to psychological pressure that slowly wears down emotional stability over time. Not through dramatic violence, but through absence. Absence of touch. Absence of conversation. Absence of ordinary human interaction. And critics argue that once punishment reaches that level, society risks crossing a dangerous moral line. That debate has followed ADX Florence almost since the day it opened. And the prison has become larger than itself because of it. It is no longer viewed simply as a federal facility hidden in Colorado. It became a symbol in larger national arguments about justice, punishment, safety, and human rights. What makes the debate so difficult is that both sides are responding to real fears. One side fears dangerous violence. The other fears psychological destruction carried out slowly behind prison walls. Neither concern is imaginary. And perhaps that is why ADX Florence continues haunting the public imagination decades later. Because the prison forces people to sit inside that moral tension without offering easy answers. Some inmates housed their committed acts that horrified the world. Terror attacks, murders, organized violence, crimes so severe that even discussing rehabilitation feels emotionally difficult for many people. But at the same time, long-term isolation unsettles people at an instinctive human level. Most individuals understand, even without studying psychology, that complete separation from normal life can deeply affect the mind. And ADX Florence was built around exactly that separation. The prison strips away almost everything familiar. Movement becomes controlled. Communication becomes limited. The outside world fades slowly into distance. Days repeat themselves with mechanical precision. Years pass quietly behind concrete walls. And eventually, for many inmates, time itself starts feeling strange. Former prisoners have described losing emotional connection to ordinary life. Some struggled to hold conversations after years of isolation. Others said they became detached from reality outside prison walls because their world had become so small and repetitive. That emotional shrinking may be one of the most disturbing aspects of supermax incarceration. Not dramatic suffering, not visible violence, but the gradual narrowing of existence itself. And yet, despite decades of criticism, lawsuits, and public debate, ADX Florence remains open because federal officials continue believing the prison serves an essential purpose. There are still inmates considered too dangerous for standard prison populations. There are still fears surrounding terrorism, organized crime, and violence against correctional officers. There are still individuals authorities believe require the highest possible level of control. So the prison continues operating almost exactly as designed. Quietly, efficiently, far from public view. And maybe that distance matters too. Most Americans will never see the inside of ADX Florence. They will only hear stories about it. Stories about infamous inmates. Stories about isolation. Stories about men disappearing into concrete cells for years at a time. That separation allows the prison to become something almost mythological in public culture. A place people imagine more than truly understand. Movies exaggerate it. Documentaries investigate it. Politicians debate it. But the actual reality inside the prison remains mostly hidden behind steel doors and government procedures. Only the people inside experience it directly. The guards, the inmates, the staff moving through those hallways every day while the rest of the country continues living ordinary life far away from the Colorado desert. And perhaps that is the strangest part of all. While ADX Florence became one of the most famous prisons in America, daily life there is built around silence and invisibility. No dramatic escapes, no public spectacle, just routine containment carried out year after year. The doors open electronically. Meals slide through narrow slots. Footsteps echo through controlled hallways. And somewhere inside those cells are people the government decided could never safely return to normal prison populations again. Some will likely die there. Some have already spent decades there. And outside the prison, the debate continues. Is ADX Florence a necessary defense against extraordinary danger? Or is it evidence of how far fear can push a justice system? There may never be a single answer everyone accepts, because prisons are ultimately reflections of the societies that build them. They reveal what a country fears, what it values, what it believes people deserve after committing terrible acts. And ADX Florence reveals something important about America, a country deeply committed to freedom, but also deeply afraid of losing safety. Those two ideas have always existed in tension with one another. Freedom and security, humanity and punishment, rehabilitation and control. Inside ADX Florence, that tension becomes concrete. Literal walls built from national fear and national determination. A prison created not because America stopped believing in human rights, but because many people believed some individuals represented dangers too severe for ordinary systems to manage. Whether history ultimately judges that decision as necessary or excessive remains uncertain. But the prison still stands, hidden beneath the Colorado sky, silent, cold, unmoving, and every morning, somewhere inside those concrete walls, another steel door opens, another meal is delivered, another day of isolation begins, while outside the prison, the rest of the world keeps moving forward.